Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kathleen Jamieson. I'm a professor at the Annenberg Public Policy Center, University of Pennsylvania, also Annenberg School for Communication. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to a panel that's going to focus on combating disinformation. If I could just ask a show of hands, how many of you were just in the plenary session that David Sanger moderated? Okay, so we can assume that as background knowledge for most of you. We're going to work in order by creating a context for the discussion by defining what everyone means by disinformation, and then giving us some general perspective on this. And then I'm going to try to tee up a couple of questions. We'll take then comments from you and questions from you on index cards that I understand are being circulated. You've got your program in front of you. You've got the definitions of the persons who are here in terms of their identification. We've got Brett Horvath, far end of the panel, President, Guardians.ai. Suzanne Kelly, publisher and CEO, The Cyber Brief. Daniel Kimmage, Principal Deputy Coordinator, Global Engagement Center, State Department. And Sujit Raman, Associate Deputy Attorney General, Department of Justice. And in that order, they are now going to clarify what it is that we mean by disinformation. And if at the end of this we all have a common definition, you will find me on the floor in cardiac arrest. And before I ask for the first, let me just say that I've banished one phrase from the discussion. I want to banish fake news from the discussion on the grounds that anyone who accepts the words fake news is attacking journalism, since if it's news, it is not fake. Journalism, by definition, is self-correcting. If something is inaccurate and they find it out, they correct. And so you cannot have fake news. My preferred term is viral deception, VD. That's a reference to venereal disease. And I want, when you think viral deception, VD, for you to think I don't want to catch it. If I catch it, I want it cured. I certainly don't want to share it. And as a result, VD. So if you hear anyone say fake news, I'm immediately going to stand up and act as if we have active venereal disease circulating throughout the room. We're going to try, as a result, to limit this to the word disinformation, and we're going to start with Brett.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad you opened up with that tone. We need a little of that levity when talking about this. I'm the president of Guardians.ai, and we're a small company whose mission is to protect pro-democracy groups around the world dealing with information warfare and what we call engineered volatility. That's efforts to weaponize existing volatility, create volatility to interfere in markets, elections, and culture. And the form that takes is monitoring for influence attacks online or through traditional media, analyzing and then warning pro-democracy groups, companies, NGOs, the media, fighting back, and then trying to force multiply the various coalitions that we organize. And so we've worked with Fortune 100s and political campaigns and governments. Despite the great effort of our moderator to do 2 calls and plan this out, I'm going to be the guy that instantly questions the premise of the panel and say that, to me, disinformation is one part of a larger issue, which I think you could see in 2 ways. One is information warfare. It is not just about information that is wrong or misleading, but understanding the strategic drivers of this as a conflict, as hybrid warfare. People talk about, I thought there was a big mistake when the New York Times framed, when the Hong Kong protests were happening, that China was starting to copy Russia's playbook. And that, to me, is the wrong order. Gerasimov and Russian strategists really stole a lot of their stuff from the 1999 Chinese doctrine on hybrid warfare. And in that, one of the things they identified is the US military overly relies and defines its strategy and new strategy on technological capabilities without understanding cultural and economic drivers. So understanding that and that as the battlefield is really important. It's not just about misinformation and unhelpful tweets. The other is this idea of information disorder. One of the updates to Gerasimov's thinking that came from his staff last year was they don't see this as the full scaling of hybrid warfare, but the next phase for them, the goal is comprehensive destruction of the adversary by spreading information disorganization across all levels of society, military, and media and culture. So if you thought things were challenging working inside of a bureaucracy or an industry, navigating new developments before, it's all just going to get worse. And so to me, those 2 lenses are helpful, the information disorder and information warfare, to widen your aperture of the threats and hopefully some opportunities.
Thank you. Suzanne.
Great. When Kathleen asked us to give our definition of disinformation, I think mine is a very simple one that's been adopted by a lot of other people as well, which is the intentional use of false information to either deceive or manipulate. That's been around for ages. It's had different names before. It's been used in all sorts of conflicts around the world and throughout history. I think obviously what's new now is how it's spreading. With the development of technology, from my perspective, being the sole journalist up on the panel today, it's terrifying, and I think it's changed the nature of journalism, which is important to everyone, because if you think about how you get your news today versus how you got it a while back, I'm guessing that most of you get it via some sort of social media outlet. Let me give you kind of a quick example of what concerns me the most on this. Being aware of media manipulation is really important. So when I was a very young journalist, starting my very exciting career in a small town in Indiana, I was covering a story on city council. And I was called up by one of the current city council members and who wanted to give me some anonymous information about someone who was running against them, or running for a seat. The thing that was most concerning is, as a journalist, especially a young one, trying to figure out, A, is this information true? B, how am I being manipulated? And what should I do with the information? Those are three kind of critical thought processes that journalists undertake. Can this be corroborated? Is there a second source that can tell me that this is in fact true? So with the advance of technology and the introduction of social media, none of that seems to matter anymore, which is terrifying to me. If someone sees something and they read it, they think, oh, well, it must be credible. The other thing that makes that even more dangerous is tactics are changing. And what we're seeing now is people who are not falsely fabricating something out of nothing, but they're building on truth. And they're creating a false narrative around it by giving you just enough information to get you to think the way they want you to think. So I look forward to this panel talking about what we can do about this, how we need to inform ourselves, how we need to think about journalism, and how we need to get our news, and then become a little bit more analytical in our thinking about what we're taking in.
Well, let me start by thanking everyone for taking time out of your busy days to listen to us, and let me disappoint you by largely endorsing my fellow panelists' definition, which I think is very serviceable for our purposes. The Global Engagement Center's mandate covers propaganda and disinformation. It's a congressional mandate. It comes from the National Defense Authorization Act, and I will take the liberty of actually citing it. It is to direct, lead, synchronize, integrate, and coordinate efforts of the federal government to recognize, understand, expose, and counter foreign, state, and non-state propaganda and disinformation efforts. What that means practically is that we deal with specific threat actors. And so we're not an academic shop, we're a coordinating body and an operational entity. So we don't have a one-size-fits-all definition. For example, Russia very frequently traffics in outright falsehoods, and they spread them through overt and covert actors in order to exacerbate social divisions. China often promulgates misleading and sometimes entirely mendacious narratives about the benefits of its Belt and Road Initiative projects, the nature of its regional presence, its record on human rights. Jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS construct ideological systems that justify acts of violence against innocent people. These are separate, related threats, and they all require very distinct solutions. So just 2 or 3 words on what that translates into in our actual work. For Russia, we work with partners to track and expose the tools and techniques that they use, to educate and hopefully inoculate the public, and to empower the individuals and groups that are pushing back directly and often have much greater insight and credibility than a government entity like us. On China, we will shine a light on the facts, also working with partners, and those facts could take the form of a cost-benefit analysis of Belt and Road Initiative projects. They could include shining a light on the role of Chinese tech companies in carrying out the foreign policy aims of the CCP. In countering jihadist propaganda, we tend to work on highly local efforts that undermine the ideology, once again by working with partners that have the right connections and credibility to connect with exactly the right target audience. I would stress that with the jihadist problem set, it's a very small target audience in general, and it's really about identifying. And in all of these cases, to get a practical outcome, it's really important for us to identify, first of all, the activities that are most damaging to U.S. national interest, because that is our congressional mandate, to identify the vulnerable or susceptible audiences that are targeted by these malign actors, and then to identify the most credible people and platforms for pushing back, and throughout having rigorous means of measuring effectiveness. Thank you.
You've got the word propaganda and disinformation in your mandate.
Yes.
And since those are separable nouns, is there a clean distinction between them in your daily activities?
Practically speaking, no, because we have a single stream of activity. We don't have a propaganda section, we don't have a counter-propaganda section, a counter-disinformation section. Both of them are in our congressional mandate. I would note that they're not defined within the mandate, so we tend to look at them fairly expansively, and we look at them as being related. Propaganda is generally somewhat larger than disinformation. If you look at disinformation strictly within the definition of being an intentionally false piece of information put forward to achieve a specific aim, propaganda might be the campaign into which it's integrated. But for us, it's really a single stream of work.
And presumably propaganda could also be the insertion of something that does not have a factual base.
Yes.
So it could be statements of opinion, rhetorical questions, et cetera.
Right. Yes.
Thank you. Sujit.
So I get to go last, which means I get to be the shortest of the presenters. Do we have any lawyers in the room? I'm curious.
Anyone willing to self-identify as a lawyer, please
I
raise
see
your
one
hand.
way back there.
We have one.
I share your pain. So let me say this. I would echo what many of the other panelists have said. You know, most people define disinformation as false information, which is intended to mislead. Any good lawyer would immediately break that down into elements, right? It's got to be false information, and it has to be intended to mislead. And so you can think of information that isn't false, true information, that is nonetheless used to pursue a foreign adversary's interests, and we can talk about that in a second. And you can think about false information that isn't intentionally intended to mislead, but is sort of negligently or in an improper kind of way. That's what we call misinformation. So the terminology is very important, but I wouldn't get too hung up on it. It is important to think about what is disinformation, but I think we at the Department of Justice, and certainly the intelligence community more broadly as well, sees disinformation as a subset of a broader phenomenon that we think of as malign foreign influence operations. And each of the panelists has really touched on this a little bit. If you've got that broader category of malign foreign influence operations, you can think about subsets within it. Some of it is disinformation, some of it is misinformation, some of it is outright hacking, right, where adversaries break into computer systems and try to steal information and disseminate it. Much of it true sometimes, but deployed in a very strategic kind of way. Some of it deployed in a half sort of way so that you only get part of the picture. So our adversaries employ these operations, malign foreign influence operations, to pursue their own geopolitical interests and sort of use different techniques to advance those interests. So I know there's going to be a lot more conversation as we go forward, but I would say disinformation is important. It's something we need to focus on, but it's just one subset of a much broader phenomenon, all of which is part of a broader program, if you will, that our adversaries use to try to minimize American power and influence and maximize their own power and influence.
So one of the questions that one might ask is, since we just insinuated hacking into this broader definition, is the panel, when it's talking about disinformation, going to include strategic uses of hacking, or are we talking about the other categories of social media activity and excluding hacking?
Just if I can go first, I think it would be difficult to split out the act of hacking from disinformation, but that's assuming you're only talking about cyber work, right? There's a lot of disinformation that happens that isn't necessarily internet-based. You can spread disinformation through human sources. So that's the complexity of the issue. Hacking can help a foreign adversary use information operations for its own benefit. I wouldn't say that it is a necessary part of it, but it's certainly sufficient, right? A lot of our adversaries have used hacking operations to advance their own interests or to deflect attention from issue A so that people are focusing on issue B.
What I would add there is that what we increasingly see are sort of combined operations where you'll have hacking or, some sort of offensive cyber operation linked with disinformation, which is itself part of a broader propaganda campaign. And that's why you also increasingly see on the defensive side or the countering side the creation of entities like the Global Engagement Center, where we are interagency in that we ourselves might not have the right authorities to counter, say, a hacking operation, but we know the people who do and are able to connect with them and coordinate with them.
Okay. Suzanne, anything?
I'd say hacking is a different, from my perspective, hacking is a different tool and tactic. I think hacking, as we've seen in previous campaigns, into someone's campaign emails and releasing that information is different from disinformation. The problem with that is you might be spreading something that is true. You might be advancing your hope to get, our traditional kind of smear campaigns against someone to persuade someone to vote one way or another by using that true information. I think the real danger comes in when you take that true information and then you build a false narrative around it. You've already exposed that someone has done something that is controversial. Therefore, each of us walks away with that idea that we already have prejudice against that person because we know that that's true, it's been verified, and anything further that's said must be true. I think that's the trap that we fall into, and we have to be very careful from the consumer side of information in making sure that we're being more analytical. Again, it's my favorite thing to go back to. But I think they're different. I think hacking has its own dangers and risks, but it's different to me than disinformation.
Yeah, I think the question highlights some of the challenges. It's encouraging to hear a push to merge cyber warfare and information warfare, but it needs to happen a lot faster. There are differences, and which is worth noting is, in cyber warfare, it is binary, right? Did a database get hacked? Did information get obtained? In information warfare, it's more complicated. Narratives and cognition and everything in the ecologies that's happening. We don't have good mathematical or analytical models to understand that. That's why we still need humans. But it's crazy to me because even one of the most famous examples from 2016, John Podesta's emails get hacked and then get leaked and become a point of ongoing narrative attacks. We worked with a large bank that had a small foreign-based activist group that was targeting them with automated accounts on Twitter, but then they were also launching sophisticated phishing attacks on the executives through email, and then getting in and trying to anticipate their response. In addition to what I said about information warfare and information disorder, I think this is better understood as a war of cognition. And cognition happens at the nexus of culture and technology. And so designing an organizational response and what to do about it, thinking about the cognition between the humans and the machines in the system, how that can get corrupted and how it can change is important for both the human and the machine learning and the adaptability of an organization.
What I hear you saying, Brett, what I hear you saying, Sujit, is we need to find a vocabulary that encompasses both of these kinds of activities to be consistent with the integrated response that our government is now trying to marshal and our tech sector is trying to marshal, and we're struggling to find the language. And to that, I'd like to add one more thing before we go into the larger questions that are at issue here, which is when you say that the disinformation is a core concept of this, you have to account for the possibility that some things that are malign foreign influence are accurate and come into the system in accurate form.
Absolutely.
And so the word disinformation, by virtue of carrying the notion that it is inaccurate, causes a problem if literally you want to code this stuff and say part of the credibility that the Russian trolls built with their constituencies was built out of trafficking information out to like-minded constituencies who would as a result be more likely to identify, assuming that they were part of the same community, that the troll was actually a person in Detroit who was talking to you, or it was actually a housewife in Florida who was talking to you. And so I think in the process of listening to your discussion, what I'm hearing is this community is trying to find a vocabulary consistent with the government discussion that we were hearing in the last, and the tech sector discussion here in the last panel, that is an integrated one that lets us address these in an integrated fashion.
I would just add that I wouldn't get too hung up on the concept of information as though veracity is the gold standard here. There's a whole scholarly literature on influence which more or less boils down to people are more influenced by emotion than by information. And so, I think that educated people like the group gathered here, we tend to get very focused on definitions, but I don't think this is in the end really about the veracity standard of how many false or true bits of information are being spread, or whether or not what a Russian troll farm is disseminating is technically true or untrue. In its actual reception and emotional effect on people, veracity is certainly a component, but I wouldn't privilege it as being the most important.
So we've complexified the definition. We've said we're still in search of encompassing language, and we're now going to turn to one of the two questions we hope to provide answers from the perspective of our four panelists, too. The first is, what will the country probably face in 2020 that we did not face in 2016 as it pertains to whatever this definition is that we've now offered? And let's again go in the same order.
Yeah, so I think the biggest difference is there are more actors in the battlefield, and the biggest risk is time. So in 2016, there was a building. It didn't all start there. There was a lot of similar activities going on before that, 2013, 2014. But now we have way more actors, both in the public and private sector, other nation states, and we're on this exponential curve. And this is one of the reasons why our approach to technology usually doesn't work. So I'm going to say two things about the difference that matter. One is technology, the other is time. So we have worked the last 3 years to prototype a asymmetric strategic and tactical doctrine to defeat information warfare. And one of the things we've seen is that you have to focus not just on one tech, because top-down organizations that try and attack this, whether it's the most well-funded presidential campaign or a military, will always be outgunned by the information warfare machines of Russia and China, and they will never be able to keep up with the rate of change and evolving tactics. The second is adaptive queries. The technology has to be understandable, because if you're a media organization or a military, your internal taxonomy and your own little algorithm is probably going to be insufficient at some point, probably very soon. And you're going to have to work with others inside your organization to say, why is this weird thing not being picked up by my anomaly detection I just spent $5 million on? And then the last is adaptive queries, what we call defensible active measures. This, for us, is about going on the offense, but not just spreading more misinformation or counter-narratives, but really fighting back. I'll close with, to me, why we have to think about time as a risk is we're kind of in the space, if anyone's seen the last Avenger movie. We're living in strange times, but time is the most important part of this, and we don't have much of it. And so from our standpoint, it's looking at the past, the present, and the future. Doing an interdisciplinary understanding of the geopolitical and cultural drivers that might lead to risk and an influence attack being weaponized. Like, America is dysfunctional about talking about race. That's a great place to attack. Then it's the present, right? You have to work with coalitions inside of your organization or between sectors to mobilize those research groups to push forward the state of the art for data science. It's not going to work what was developed six months ago. And then finally is the future. You cannot survive, much less thrive, if you do not have an anticipatory posture. Scenario planning and modeling what might happen. And the kind of opening right now is that, comms and anomaly technology is inherently reactive, right? People are just looking at tweet counts and then reacting to it. Scenario planning has been incredibly abstract. You get a bunch of people in a room with whiteboards and say, self-driving cars and blockchain, what could happen? But now that we have data around influence and cultural drivers and can model systems, you can build learning between the scenarios you're anticipating and the questions you're asking and your sensing systems are looking for. And the learning loop between those are key. So I think an understanding that there's going to be a lot more. The Nancy Pelosi deepfake video, the launching apps that basically tricked tens of millions of Americans to giving a Russian company complex models of their microexpressions and their identity. Those are just a sample of what's going to come.
I think building
let me impose a terrible burden on the panel. If you've heard something that has been said by somebody else that you disagree with, please make sure you take the opportunity to say, and by the way, I disagree with that, because in the absence of that, I'm going to assume that we've got agreement on what the earlier people have said.
Pressure.
So Suzanne, and by the time we get to Sujit, you've got a great job.
I think the thing that concerns me the most talking about anticipatory posture is we're not talking about the group that is the most important in this scenario. I was very happy in the last session to hear Jeanette Manford say that the government is in a better position to safeguard the elections in 2020 than it was in 2016. There are better structures in place. There's more knowledge. There's more information sharing and more coordination between agencies. But when I think about more broadly, the real targets of disinformation, it's all of us in this room. And are we taking an anticipatory posture to be prepared for this? And we're not, if you ask me. So just not a shameless plug, but one nonetheless, the Cipher brief has undertaken a months-long process of publishing information about what disinformation is. And we started with Disinformation 101. And the idea is if more broadly the media, which has the largest outreach to all of us, doesn't take this seriously and doesn't start to tell us what is it, what does it look like, what does it want. Oh, and by the way, you might want to know that when you're feeding your social media feed and you're giving it information about yourself and you're telling it what you like and what you don't like and you're responding to your friends on Facebook who have political views and you feel differently, you are feeding the machine. And we don't talk enough about that. You know, about, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago now, I did a story for NPR on mapping the human brain and then showing it pictures of retail items to see what stimulated the most interest, and then retail agencies using that information to try to come up with campaigns that would get you to buy their products. I mean, this has been going on forever. And the more information that we put out there without understanding how it's coming back at us in malicious ways is kind of creating our own world of doom, if you ask me.
And as you're presenting, we're getting a whole series of questions that are focused on basically the same thing, so I'm just going to throw them into the mix, but please answer with a larger question. One says, how can the public better recognize and reject disinformation when so many don't believe that what they're consuming is in fact disinformation? Another person asks, how can we teach John Q. public to be skeptical of what is read online? What kind of critical thinking skills can be quickly and widely taught? And then another asks, how will we address this challenge when we consider that the most consumption of information, most of those who consume information are not highly analytical or discerning? The level, by the way, of cynicism about public capacity here is remarkable.
It's scary. I'll just, I'll make my comments short and share the time with others. But, I spent a lot of time thinking about this because I have family members and friends who believe stuff they see, and it concerns me. And I don't think that I'm smarter than they are. I think I focus more on this issue of how I'm becoming a victim. And so I think we need to kind of think about that. In terms of things you can do, I lived overseas for a long time and people were always pointing me out as the American. And I'm like, why do you always say that? What does that mean to you? And they're like, well, you question everything. Like, you don't just simply accept something. And I don't think we're doing that now. I think in this particular case, we're not living up to it. But question what you read. Does it make sense? Really basic things. Seek the context around it. The more layers you're on, put it on yourself to say, wait a minute, let me see if I can poke the holes in this as a reader or a viewer. And then get news from more than one source. If you have already lined up who you follow in Facebook and they're all the same places, you're going to get the same message. Put it upon yourself to be that critical thinker and go and read what somebody else, which might have a very different perspective, might be saying about that same issue. And you will be amazed at how that starts to create a broader context and gives you a better opportunity to make an informed decision about whether something's true or not.
And please interrupt me at any point on this. I think Suzanne raised a really crucial point about this. I was in a conversation with an elder statesman of the kind of the internet age, and he was saying, we really need critical thinking. We got to solve this with critical thinking. And the problem here is that contributes to this idea that the people that are the victims of disinformation are the other. They're not us. They're people that think differently and aren't they don't listen to the radio shows we do. Blah blah blah. But this is not just a weaponization of knowledge. It is a weaponization of cognition, and that is about emotion. And some of the smartest people I've met, brilliant scientists, are also some of the ones that are most emotional in ways they don't realize. And if you don't think Facebook or a really good influence operator can able to psychographically target you and find subtle exploitations, then you are contributing to your organization's lack of cognitive security. Any executive that does not have the humility to understand that they are the first point of attack is going to be a problem. We've seen efforts that can come in with a small group of Twitter accounts and focus on a chief security officer, chief marketing officer, or CEO, and they just try and get in their Twitter feed just to make sure they see one article that is biased, that is aligned with their biases. And so, I'm giving away my identity as a millennial and my upbringing in the West Coast with a little woo-woo, but these are hard-fought lessons. One of the things we focus on, because, if you look at John Boyd and combat approaches that look at cognition, what are the simple protocols? And one of them for us is, rather than looking at the other, is elevate the conversation through increased self-awareness. Don't elevate the conversation by telling people they're not critical thinking, doing good critical thinking. Because that is how you can understand how am I being targeted.
One of the things we appear to agree on is that we've got public vulnerability that is going to be persistent in 2020, and there are some ways that we might be able to address it, but before we talk about those additional ways, let's find out what it is that the country probably will face in 2020 we didn't face in 2016. From Daniel.
Sure. First, in good government tradition, a caveat that the Global Engagement Center is really focused abroad, where we look to our domestic colleagues primarily for things like safeguarding the elections. On that said, on the minus side, as has already been noted, I think we're going to see a proliferation of tools that are getting better and better in the deployment of these tools. Most of you in this room are very familiar with these. These are individual bots by design, botnets, the application of machine learning, artificial intelligence to direct computational propaganda, deep fakes, ad tech. All of these tools are getting better every single day. Also, the number of nefarious actors able to deploy them is getting broader. I would flag one specific danger here, which is that greater awareness and heightened vigilance, which are good things, in this context of better tools and more nefarious actor, can also give rise to more false alarms and confusion. Many more people will be looking for all of this activity than was the case in 2016. So I would flag that. On the plus side, though, the U.S. government is definitely better prepared and coordinated than it was in the past. You see this being covered in the media. You see in announcements. It's definitely true. Social media companies have significantly stepped up their game, and researchers have really contributed to our understanding of malign influence activities. I can't stress enough how many useful, very detailed reports we have on things like the Internet Research Agency. It's almost too much for one person to follow, but we do understand a lot better what is happening and what to look for. So that's what I would flag. Oh, and then let me just add on this question of the public and how cynical we should be. It reminds me a little bit of some of the debates we had 10, 15 years ago about the al-Qaeda problem and recruitment and counter-radicalization. There were these very bitter debates. It's ideology, it's religion, it's poverty, it's resentment, it's grievances. And eventually those debates began to die down as research came in that showed that people join these groups for different reasons. And the person who joins out of a very deep ideological motivation, you're not going to win them over by offering them a job. But there are people who are impoverished and they see it as a certain opportunity, and you can maybe peel them away through an economic incentive. And those debates have largely faded in favor of really understanding who the vulnerable populations are, really understanding how to get at those populations, and then applying the right tools. I would venture that there is something similar here. The difference is one of scale, and it's the problem that I think we're all grappling with. Groups like al-Qaeda can achieve a certain measure of success if they recruit very tiny numbers of people and are able to pull off more or less single-digit numbers of attacks. When we're talking about the disinformation activities here, particularly those promulgated by states, they are targeting tens of millions of people. That said, I would still posit that we can break down some of the motivations, and I think that the skepticism in the room is well motivated. There is going to be some segment that you can get at with critical thinking, that you can get at with education, but the whole history of human endeavor shows us that critical thinking is not going to solve all of our problems.
But before we completely give up on it, There are efforts now to increase the likelihood that those in elementary, secondary, and high schools see curation of the content in their feed as one of their responsibilities, not moving things into the stream for their like-minded friends without having evaluated its accuracy, for example, without checking to see what the source of it is, et cetera. To the extent that those kinds of activities increase the sophistication through the school system, we are building some capacity. We're not going to overcome human biases, but we're going to build some capacity. And those of you who are not familiar with the iCivics intervention in schools, which is called Newsfeed Defenders, this is an effort in the middle schools to try to help students curate a website not about anything to do with politics. So they give them some misinformation about college scholarships or some misinformation about health. And they ask whether the student wants to post it up on the student's site for the student's friends in a school-like environment. And the students get points for increasing the likelihood that what they're sharing is good information, reliable, robust information. They lose points when they go for getting clicks and approval by putting things up that are suspect. So there are those kinds of interventions at play. And I think we ought to at least acknowledge that they may make some difference with some people under some circumstances. The academic community also knows that if people are highly aware that they are likely to be manipulated, they are more wary of content. The question is, how do you stay in that space, faced with the changes that we're seeing the panel articulate? We've got increasing speed, we've got increasing capacity to show you that your community approves of things, hence increase the likelihood that unthinkingly you gravitate toward that approval and share with others, thereby creating a sense that the whole community is on board with an idea, which actually has very few followers, but has a whole lot of bots and some malign actor behind it. So Sujit, what's your best answer to the question, what are we going to face in 2020 that we didn't face in 2016 that the three other panelists haven't identified?
So I get to go last again, and it's great because I've got such brilliant co-panelists. I don't have a lot to say. Really, I think we've covered the waterfront on that. If the question is, what's different from 2016 or even 18, I think the adversaries are not acting any differently. They're going to have the very same ultimate objectives, which is to, again, create division, sow discord in U.S. Society, and try to attack the integrity of our democratic institutions, right? The techniques will change. They will certainly change. I think a lot of the points made earlier about the speed is something that is different. And that is one major difference between now and 2016, is the awareness piece of it. And I don't think we should discount that. There is a silver lining in all of this, which is I think all of us are much more aware of what adversaries are trying to do. And so whether it's the work we're doing within the government, whether it's work we're doing across governments, right? The federal government has an important role, but state governments have an incredibly important role, particularly when it comes to infrastructure. All the voting infrastructure in this country is controlled by state governments. That's by constitutional design. And so the awareness among our state partners and our local partners is infinitely greater now than it was, say, 4 years ago. Of course, the work that the government is doing with the private sector, not only the social media companies, although they're a major part of this, but with industry as well. Just general sharing of cyber threat indicators, general awareness of what's happening on networks. We are in a very different position, I would say in a much more positive position today than we were 4 years ago. So you've got to be careful. You've got to be, aware of what's going on. I, am a prosecutor by training. I can't tell you what we need to do with the school system. That's out of my area of expertise. But the ultimate point of needing to be conscious of what you're reading and consulting multiple sources, that's the wonderful thing about the internet. The entire world's information is at your fingertips. If there's a world event going on, check out what, the UK newspapers are saying about it. Check out what the European papers are saying about it. Check out what, a newspaper in Dallas is saying as opposed to a newspaper in Chicago. You can do all of that in 5 minutes in a way that you could never do 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So use that information glut to your advantage without being manipulated by it or being taken advantage of.
I would just like to add one more thing that I think is an important difference from 2016 that we'll see in 2020. And that's about something that I think is relevant to the people in the room in a big way, and that's the politics of technology. In 2016, people really weren't talking at this level or strategic clarity around the systemic risks in US technology systems. We tried to get the word out in 2016. We were worried, ran the thought experiment, could two Facebook engineers in the newsfeed team change the outcome of the presidential election through small modifications to what shows up in the newsfeed, change the outcome of the election without anyone at the company or the FBI finding out? We got sourced inside of Facebook, reverse engineer their code review process, and figured out the answer was yes. We published that in the summer, and we know Mark Zuckerberg was asked about that by one of his employees at Facebook town hall. And the employee said, should we try and do something to stop Trump? But we're in a totally different time now. And we're about to have, as a country, a very important and necessary conversation on reform and safeguards in the US tech sector, which needs to happen. And I've been an advocate of pushing the tech companies to do better. However, we're at great risk of that political debate, which don't be surprised if you see it soon in presidential debates and major policy positions and the tip of the tongues of average Americans. We have a real risk of that debate gets dysfunctional, both for good reasons and also foreign interference reasons. You can't think of many things close to the top of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin's wish list than creating further division between Washington, D.C. and Silicon Valley. We're in a full global information war, and some of the most important systems we need to have a whole of society response are based in Silicon Valley. That's, since Edward Snowden in 2014, has been increasingly distrusting. So if we have a dysfunctional debate at that level and we are not building bridges aggressively and creatively between those two power centers, it's kind of like if in World War II, Boeing would not answer FDR's phone calls. And we have that disadvantage where an authoritarian country like China can share algorithms and data and cross-subsidize between its companies and its public sector and race forward ahead. So that's something that I really encourage folks to start thinking about and getting ready for in the very near term.
And that's a good transition. Let's do this as a lightning round. Suppose that you could just control the universe to the extent that humans can, and you got to make one change to better prepare the country for 2020. Better prepared than it was in 2018, better prepared than 2016. What one change would you want to make, and how confident are you we can actually do it? And since we've been disadvantaging Sujit throughout, we'll start with him.
Well, that's the $25,000 question, or maybe $25 million question, right? I can take the easy route and say awareness, right? If you could, with a sort of snap of the fingers, make people aware of what is true and what is not true, or at least what are the efforts to try to manipulate them, at least in the disinformation context, that would go, 99% of the way towards a solution. The deeper issues are, efforts by our foreign adversaries to try to manipulate outcomes. And that's something they've been doing for a very long time. So what we need to do is make sure that we are advancing our defensive capabilities as well as our offensive capabilities to make sure that the way that technology is being used to accelerate the efforts that, adversaries have been trying to launch against us for decades don't succeed.
Magic wand, Daniel.
I don't know how to achieve this, but I would wish for vastly improved transparency in the social media sphere, from the realm of algorithms to the origination of content to the impact of that content.
Okay. Suzanne?
I really can't build on that. 100% awareness.
To me, it's got to be a national strategy. And we focus on tech solutions when really most organizations in the country have a problem of strategy that doesn't leverage or amplify existing capabilities. I don't need to tell anyone in the room that we haven't had a grand U.S. national strategy in at least 30 years. And this has strategic and tactical implications. People think that Russia, you could say, has a really aggressive offensive information warfare strategy. I would say it's actually a very coherent and accelerating defensive strategy of their core principles of authoritarianism. The core principle is divide any other power center that threatens the authoritarian and spread that. And there's alignment between the strategy, the ends, and the means, and those principles. And that's why you see weaponization of algorithmic platforms that feed off controversy. And the last thing I will say is that to have a coherent strategy, it has to be built on principles. What are you defending and what are you attacking? In the Cold War, via the Active Measures Working Group, we had a real clear idea of what we stood for. And we, as best we could, authentically defended those principles. And look, really elite teams can spread some like false information in a tactical way, but that has diminishing returns. We have to have principles that can be aggressively pushed out through our technical systems, through our policies, through our foreign service workers. And without that, I don't know how we win this war.
We haven't talked about the press as a vulnerable player in all of this. So to this point, we've said public, we've said tech sector, we've talked about government response, but I argue in a book called Cyber War how Russian trolls and hackers helped elect a president that the biggest probable effect was created by the hacking. And as a result, we bring into play the role of our press and our communication systems in trafficking information into the media agenda in ways that potentially changed the considerations of voting, and created an imbalance in messaging that disadvantaged one of the candidates in ways that she would not have been disadvantaged had the hacked content not been there. So I would add to the discussion that we need to make sure, as we focus on what the platforms are doing and can do, what the government is doing and can do, what those two sectors can do together, we also need to ask, what is the role of the press? And to the extent that the newsrooms are not publicly telling us what they are going to do differently from 2016, I think we have a problem, because it would be reassuring to know that confronted with the same situation, they would play this thing out differently than they did in the last time, which raises a question raised by an individual in the audience who says, what role does free speech play in considerations in your work? And I would also ask, what are the considerations for free press in your work, since we live in a system in which those two are bedrock principles of our system of governance? And I'm going to ask Suzanne, you're the one who's representing the press here. How are you doing? How are they doing?
I think that's a really good point. I think there needs to be a collaboration among the respectable media outlets that have the furthest reach in this country to come up with their own campaign, instead of waiting for the government to come up with a see something, say something when you see that there's a risk. I would like to see most of these media organizations come together and come up with something similar. I think also, to the question of what we should expect moving forward. I've thought about this a lot. The problem, again, as I said at the very top, isn't new. Our self-ascribed millennial up here mentioned the Avengers movie earlier. I'm going to harken back to 1997, for those of you who will remember with me, the James Bond movie, Tomorrow Never Dies, where the whole plot in this movie was this maniacal media conglomerate owner who was feeding disinformation into the global news machine and using that information to conquer the world. Well, I hate to say that 22 years later, we haven't really learned a lot about it, but I'm pretty sure there's no James Bond coming to save us. So the question then becomes, what are you going to do to save yourself from being a victim in a scenario like that?
And we have a question that's related, which asks, how are media editors and writers being trained or training themselves to consider how to write about disinformation campaigns without amplifying the destructive messages? Anybody want to try that one?
So can I actually, just to feed off of that, because I would love to ask this question of my colleagues on the panel who are members of the media, Suzanne, or anyone else who's out there. If you were to get a phone call from somebody saying, I've got some really juicy information. I mean, this isn't hypothetical. You can sort of figure out how this works. I've got hacked emails. I can guarantee you they're 100% true. You might win a Pulitzer Prize if you publish it. Do you publish it?
I hate to tell you, those conversations happen a lot more often than you would think.
Yeah.
People are constantly looking for different ways to manipulate. I think, as Kathleen alluded to earlier, there might be some different decisions made after we saw what happened with the hacking of John Podesta's emails and how it was used. Those are conversations that there are actually institutions within media organizations. I was formerly with one of them where there's a kind of a standards and practices division, and you get together with the folks from that division and also your legal counsel and decide what you do with information that you get. The one question, however, that we're not answering and we're not asking enough is there any news value to this information, and what is the news value to this? Is it simply slandering someone with the intent of finding an outcome that the person who gave you the information wants? I think you have to have a series of questions that you answer before you make a decision to publish something like this. Is the public going to benefit from knowing it? Is it something where, you've hacked emails of someone and they show that they've committed crimes against people? That's probably information that people would need to know. It's a good conversation to start having. These conversations are happening right now. These requests are being made. People are anonymously. How many of you notice how many times anonymous sources are cited these days? But you also have to remember that once information is out there, media is a business, and there's a bottom line, and there's a competition to it, and there is a drive to be first with information. And I remember with one of my former employers, a very simple question of, do we want to be first or do we want to be right? And I don't see half as many organizations asking those questions anymore. There are still some really good ones out there. But I think we have to think about media as a business, and the fact that if you don't run it, if the New York Times doesn't run it, there's a blog that's going to run it, and guess what? They're going to get just as wide of a reach and just as great of a reception to that information than if it would have been printed in the Times. That's what I meant earlier about the technology. It's changing the entire field of journalism.
But let me just add a caveat. If something is not legitimized by the mainstream media, it is fundamentally different than something that is legitimized. So if the excuse of the mainstream media is you can find it someplace in the news ecosphere, hence we must cover it, we are sidetracking the possibility that the fact of it being legitimized in the mainstream carries a persuasive capacity all by itself. I think the conundrum here for people in the reporting business is enormous. I think the editorial responsibility is immense, and I think it's extraordinarily difficult. But that legitimizing function is there. Secondarily, we tend to underestimate the extent to which the mainstream media do have effects throughout the social media sphere because of all the relaying and all of the sharing that occurs. Not that one would ever say to them one shouldn't do something in the system of government, but rather to say that if they all had a standard that they applied that was consistent, it would have potentially an impact in relationship to the rest, because it could be marked off more clearly as being more propagandistic in intent, whether domestic or international. And Brett, you want to say something?
I think that's a really profound and important question you asked, and I think there's a clear moral dimension to it and a ruthlessly pragmatic strategic dimension to it as well. It's not hypothetical for me. We've discovered efforts to send us information they wanted distributed to different groups, and we found out. But one of the challenges, look, I understand and respect the need for military and IC groups to use all available options, and I get that. And when we saw how bad this problem was in early 2016, we went quiet and we explored all available options because it seemed really bad. But the more we looked at what we were considering, wow, we're starting to resemble the types of conspiracies and tactics that we were fighting against. And having the clarity of principles of what do we actually stand for has a moral dimension, but the strategic dimension is Russia is able to push out power to the edges and be more efficient and move faster than us because there is coherence of the principles, right? It is spread confusion and division. If they underpay a privateer contractor to spread some misinformation and it gets discovered, they have a resilient strategy where that can actually be a benefit because then it causes more controversy. We don't have that ability, and so more of the power of the elite information operations is concentrated. It's more fragile. And so we're losing out on second and third order magnitude capabilities, both inside of organizations, the government, and then the public to work on this thing. There's clarity of what we stand for. We can be really aggressive in pursuing it. But if you can't answer that question, you can't expect your frontline IO worker or your comms director to answer it if there's not the clarity and alignment of principles.
Let me rephrase a question to the two people who are here in a government capacity. What are the rules that govern when the various government agencies will tell the press and the public that we have a threat? And are those systematic enough and thoughtfully considered enough that you are confident that they give us the alert that we need without causing other systemic problems by virtue of intervening in an electoral dialogue?
This is actually not an area where we work. Actually, I think this is more appropriate for our domestic.
So I'm happy to address that. And that is one major change, I would say, since 2016. Actually, last year, the Attorney General asked a group of us to come together and create a policy for the Department of Justice and the FBI that deals with the disclosure of malign foreign influence operations. So before, there was no real department-wide policy. By the way, that policy is now essentially extended across the government. And it's available online for anyone who's interested. You know, the report of the Attorney General's Cyber Digital Task Force was issued last summer. You can Google it. And there's a whole publicly announced disclosure policy that deals with that very question. Now, as with any policy, it has some play in the joints. You've got to look at different factors. Do we want to reveal sources and methods? Do we want to make sure that we're not amplifying the adversary's efforts? So if they just do a little drop in the bucket, are we, putting a megaphone to it by calling attention to it? So there's a number of different factors that we take into account. But those are the factors that we think about. Are we revealing intelligence sources? Are we somehow shooting ourselves in the foot by amplifying? Who should be the right person within the government? It may not always be the Justice Department or the director of the FBI. Should it be the head of ODNI? Should it be another institution within the government? Those are the kinds of conversations that this policy sets up so that we think about how to disclose and when to disclose and what the appropriate way to disclose is. So it's, as I said, it's a rather complex policy, but one that I think tries to get to the right answer. And the most important thing is that it establishes neutral principles up front. Because again, if you're in the government, the last thing you want to be accused of is divulging or releasing information in a partisan kind of way. As you get closer to an election, the allegation will be made, well, you release this information because it helps your political opponent or it helps your own campaign. The whole goal of the policy is to get away from that by setting the principles and the factors up front in a neutral way, and that's what governs our behavior going forward.
If you had those policies in place in 2016, how, if at all, would what the public and press have learned been different?
So it's hard to do the counterfactual. I think the likelihood, and this is just me in my personal capacity, I wasn't in my position in 2016. I think there probably would have been disclosure of what was being seen by the intelligence community earlier and in a more forceful way. That's my guess, but it's all hypothetical. It's very hard to second guess decisions that folks were making under, frankly, novel circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Daniel?
Yeah, just let me inject a note of optimism. The discussion of journalism and the role of journalism sometimes gets a little negative in this context. Our legislation literally commands us to facilitate the distribution of fact-based narratives. We have a mechanism called the Information Access Fund that is specifically designed to support, a number of things, but journalism and journalists among them, with the caveat, of course, this is all outside the U.S. But, we really look to journalists, a robust and healthy journalism media sector, and in particular investigative journalism, as one of the great tools and assets we have against particularly Russian activity. A lot of this scurrying around with bags of money in the night, all of the nefarious stuff that they get up to, when it is exposed, you have a dual effect. There is, the curtain is pulled back and you see, but also, as we discussed earlier, people react differently when they know that they are being manipulated or that someone is trying to manipulate them. And there is no better mechanism for exposing that than credible, in-depth investigative journalism. And we're very happy to be able to work to support some of that in a number of places.
We have a question that asks, are we looking in the wrong places when it comes to finding and rooting out disinformation? By focusing on Facebook, Instagram, or even the outlets like Sputnik and Russia Today, RT, is the U.S. fighting the last war? What are the next apps, outlets that Russia, China, and others will target? Are we forward-looking enough? Can you anticipate the unanticipated, and how well are you doing it?
So there's always going to be a certain amount of fighting the last war. It's inevitable. There's a shock to the system. You adjust the system, and then something will come that you can't anticipate. We work very hard with marketing firms, with tech firms to look at the platforms that people are using. When we look at the transmission of propaganda disinformation, we absolutely don't limit ourselves to the platforms that everyone thinks of. The good and bad communicators use what people use. So whether that's TikTok or Snapchat or platforms that are particular to, say, Russian environments like Odnoklassniki or Vkontakte, we work either to understand that, or we work with partners who are in that environment and understand that. Does that mean that we have? What I would say is, I would classify that as a known unknown. Okay, we might not know exactly which platform something is happening, but we know that things are going to be proliferating to other platforms. I'm more worried about the unknown unknowns, things that are, of a different order of magnitude or an entirely different approach than simply disseminating information on platforms. We have a fair amount of experience with that. We sort of know how that works. And if the major mystery is which platform is this going to happen on next, that's a slightly more easily solved problem than is this migrating to another dimension entirely.
Can I just add one point to that? I would agree with everything that's been said. I thought it was interesting, though, the mention of Russia Today. So, my view on RT, they are a registered agent under the Foreign Agent Registration Act.
Now, they were not in 2016.
And as a result, I think, of a lot of the, activity that's
Does everybody know what RT is? Yes, okay.
But here's my point about RT. If you see something being disseminated by Russia Today, it's coming from the Russian government. And that transparency, to get to a word that was used earlier, is, in my view, 99% of the game. They can say whatever the heck they want. I mean, in this country, we're not really in the business of censoring information. That's not certainly the federal government's job. As long as you, as a consumer, know that this video, for whatever reason, was retweeted or posted by Russia Today, you are on notice that the Russian government, for whatever reason, thinks this is worthy of my attention. As far as I'm concerned, again, as a federal prosecutor who's in the business of just enforcing the law, that is a success story. That is a positive result. And you can make your own judgment. We're not in the business of trying to shut down Russia Today. They can speak just like anybody else. What they can't do is speak covertly in a way that's intended to mislead or confuse people. That not only triggers federal criminal law, but that's exactly getting to the point that we were talking about earlier about again, adversaries using information in a way that's sort of, a sword. So from my perspective, a lot of it deals with disclosure. As long as the consumer knows where the information is coming from, they can make their own independent judgment. They need to make their own independent judgment about whether or not to believe it. It's the covert action by foreign adversaries that, in my view, triggers a lot of the problems. And I may not be alone in that, or I might be alone in that, but I think as a federal government official, that's how we tend to think of these issues.
We're in the 3-minute countdown. I want to do a lightning round where we close saying something positive. So I would like to phrase the question this way. What one thing are you really confident about 2020 that will ensure that what something happened in 2016 is not going to have a sequel in 2020? So what is the one thing that you think we've nailed? That is, the likelihood this is going to happen to us has now been reduced substantially in your sector or your area.
I mean, the mere fact that we're having this discussion, 18 months before the election, that all of us are focused on this problem, that within government we're going to meetings, we've got structures to coordinate, that to me is a hugely positive development and one that gives me a lot of optimism. We have really marshaled collectively as a society from, journalists to researchers to people in government to organizers of conferences like yourselves. We are focused on this in a way that we were not in 2016.
And I think the last panel told us at the plenary there are moves to integrate that are going to be more functional than what we had in 2016.
Yeah, I'll give you half good and half bad. How's that? I think on the good side, we are going to be a lot more aware as a population about what's happening in 2020 than we were in 2016, and I think that's key, really important. I think on the bad side, we're not going to be aware enough. If I could just give all of you something to walk away from this session with, a little bit of homework, go home and ask your kids who are over the age of 10 years old where they get their information, where they get their news. I guarantee you it's going to be on their phone. And ask them what apps they use. Get involved in where your kids are getting their information because they're the next generation. And then by doing so, you're already getting yourself into that critical thinking mode, and you're going to ask other people around you. But go start with your children and ask them where they get their information.
I'll make up for my earlier comments with quick bullets, promise. Number one is that we're finally talking about this at the appropriate scale. If you would tell me we were having these kind of conversations even a year ago, they were happening today, I'd be shocked and very pleasantly surprised. We're not yet identifying how existential the problem is, but there is a path forward. There are playbooks, and a couple key takeaways that I would offer to you. One, get clarity of mission. All the things I talked about, values and principles, you can distill down to have clarity of mission so you can move forward aggressively. Number two is a mandate. The mandate of the organization in this time is to be a learning organization, an accelerating learning organization. Otherwise, it will not evolve and adapt. It's machine learning and human learning. The other hopeful thing is there is precedent for this, right? I met Daniel for the first time today, but I've followed the GEC closely. The fact that GEC has been able to overcome all of the funding and bureaucratic hurdles from a couple years ago to now contributing to efforts all over the globe and overperforming given budgetary constraints is really inspiring. The work the DOJ did for 2018. There's also a lot of really good playbooks from the Baltic states and Estonia and Finland and the Baltic Elves where militaries and governments actually worked with citizens. And they had to do it, but it works really well. There are precedents, and look for those most effective tactics everywhere before, vendors in the room cover ears. Before you issue an RFP for new tech, do a survey of other tactics that have already worked because they probably exist. And then finally is get in a cognitive cadence around updating and your operations. And it give you 3 A's. Make it asymmetric, have an asymmetric mindset, and you got to think that way. 2 is accelerating. Incremental solutions are necessary, but to make it accelerating, we have to combine them. And then my last buzzword I'll leave you with is anti-fragile. A bastardized definition of that is not just being resilient, but having your posture be such that when you're attacked, you don't just withstand it, but you grow stronger and you turn that energy against your adversary. There are playbooks. There are ways forward. You do not need to buy the most expensive new quantum computer to start fighting back.
Okay. The final consummate wrap-up statement, Sujit.
Wow. I would just say coordination. It's not always visible, but the work that the folks that I get to work with every day, folks at the FBI, folks in the intelligence community, they are on this issue 24/7. And again, it's not stuff we can always talk about publicly, but you should have faith in the professionals every single day working on these issues. It's a priority for all of us, certainly at DOJ, FBI, and in the intel community. You can't ever promise outcomes, but I can guarantee you're going to get 100% effort.
And let me, as the moderator, add mine. In an environment that is more polarized than it has been in my lifetime, and I'm an elderly woman, so that's a long time, it was heartening to hear on the last panel, and it's heartening to hear here, the extent to which individuals are working together across sectors as well as within sectors to increase the likelihood that they are addressing a problem. This is being talked about not in polarized partisan terms, but in an all-on base strategic response to do what is best for the country. Thank you for the panelists. Thank you to all of you. We are now adjourned this session.